We die! We die with vengeance on our lips!
I know absolutely nothing about the Warhammer franchise, and that's a fact that often shocks myself because I'm a big fan of fantasy and sci-fi universes, and the bigger a universe is, the more likely I am to jump into it. The more entries in a game franchise, or the more books in a book series, or the more seasons in a TV show, the more excited I get. But still, Warhammer has always eluded me. Not that I didn't think the franchise looked cool or anything like that, but because honestly, I never knew where to start. Since Warhammer isn't tied to one medium, it's a multi-medium extravaganza from tabletop games to books. But as soon as I saw the first trailer for Warhammer Space Marine 2, I knew that was ending. I knew as soon as that game dropped, the gloves were coming off. And the game finally comes out today worldwide, or actually it came out a few days ago if you got the gold edition, which I did do. And sorry, I want to go on a side tangent real quick. I know a side tangent this early in a video, but just hear me out for a second. Look how sexy this gold edition is. It looks amazing on a shelf. Inside of it is the standard case and a steelbook, which is just awesome. When I spend $100 on a physical game, this is what I want to represent it in my collection. Not this, not what Star Wars Outlaws gave us with a gold edition, where it's just a standard case, no slipcover, no manual, no little trinket, nothing that makes it cooler than a standard edition, and this one was $10 more. But anyway, as I was saying, when I first saw the trailers for Space Marine 2, I was just blown away at how fun this game looked from the gameplay to the art design. I knew I needed to play it. It just looked like a refreshing change up to so many of the self-serious games I often find myself playing. I knew this game was going to consume so many hours of my life. And that it has absolutely done. I've put so many hours into this game already, which means I have a lot of thoughts that I want to share with you guys. So I'm going to jump into the review. I'm going to show you guys some raw gameplay, but before I do that, hit that subscribe button. I talk about video games on this channel all the time. I do day one reviews very frequently, but I do other video game discussions as well. My next actual review will be for the Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, but alongside that video, I'm going to release a video about me playing through and experiencing the original Dead Rising game for the first time. So yeah, just consider subscribing. But anyway, enough with this intro. Let's talk about Warhammer Space Marine 2.
What's so practical? Do not get caught when it charges at you. Eliminate your enemy, vile beast.
So first off, this review will be spoiler free. I'll talk about the story a little bit, but I won't get into any super specific details. All of the gameplay that you see in this video will be from the first 3 missions. But anyway, what kind of game is Space Marine 2? To sum it up simply, it's basically a game from the PS3, Xbox 360 era that somehow managed to find its way into a time machine to bless our lives in the year of 2024. Playing through this game reminded me so much of playing third-person shooter games from 2 generations ago, and I mean that in a good way. That's a compliment. Each moment I was playing this game, I wanted to crack open a Mountain Dew and scream profanities into a headset while in some sort of gunpowder and chainsaw smoke-induced mental state. And that's not even how I game now, or how I gamed then, by the way, but this game invokes that kind of feeling. And again, I say that statement with gratitude. In fact, so much of this game is just so old school. So I'm gonna warn you now, I'm gonna say old school vibe a lot in this video. Feel free to start taking a tally and let me know the total by the end, but Warhammer Space Marine 2 is a third-person shooter in its purest sense. It's not bogged down by overcomplications, the mixing of genres, and over-serious tone or live service elements. The heart and soul of this game is to just aim your gun and pull the trigger, while every now and then hucking a grenade into a horde or using your chainsaw sword to slice and dice. If I had to give an elevator pitch for this game, I'd say it's like Gears of War and Left 4 Dead had a baby while on vacation in the Warhammer universe, but I'm about 100% certain I'm not the first person to make that comparison. But with that being said, what is the goal of the game? What are you actually doing? What's the motivation for picking up the aforementioned gun and pulling the aforementioned trigger? Well, there's a campaign, of course. Then there's operations, which are PvE missions, separate from the campaign with their own goals, objectives, and progression system. Then there's even PvP in this game, which I, for some reason, was not expecting at all, but holy hell, do I love that it's there. But anyways, let's talk about the campaign first because, well, it's what you experience first in the game, and it sets the foundation for everything else. The story follows a dude named Titus, who previously went through some serious shit, and now he's commanding a small squad of 2 other Space Marines, and the story will have you going to a few different planets, slaughtering hordes of aliens, while simultaneously unraveling somewhat of a mystery and discovering threats a lot more serious than you previously expected. Again, I'm not well versed in Warhammer lore. This is my first time dabbling in the franchise, so the only person less qualified to talk about the specifics of this story and world and the implications of it is me from 5 days ago. But I can tell you my opinion, my perspective, and that's that the narrative and the world of this game really hooked me. I got pretty sucked into the narrative to the point that I was actually looking forward to each story beat. It had a lot of moments that I wasn't expecting, and I obviously won't spoil those for you, but it was enough to make me feel like the story always had something else that it was just waiting to reveal. But more importantly, I was surprised at how sucked into the world I became. From the lore I did learn to the art design and the aesthetics, I was just constantly floored at how this game managed to take complete control of my eye, like a little kid in a crib seeing a blue block for the first time. And I just felt so, again, insanely immersed the whole way through. I felt like I was existing in a world that was being ravaged by this non-stop war. Everywhere you look, you see Tyranids swarming battlefields or flying through the air like the monkeys in The Wizard of Oz. You see huge-ass battles happening in the distance, gunfire, and the sounds of explosions. And I just loved the feeling like I existed in an active war zone. Again, it really gave me an old-school vibe. I remember several centuries back when I would play the Call of Duty 3 or Battlefield Bad Company campaigns, and I felt like I was a smaller part of a bigger war operation that was happening around me. I don't often get that feeling anymore. Like, so many of the recent COD games and Battlefield campaigns just feel like self-contained levels that stop being real, like they stop existing the moment a loading screen happens. But everything about this world in a visual sense is just absolute eye candy. The design of the monsters, the buildings, the vehicles, the weapons, and of course the Space Marines themselves. I can already tell based on this game that I have the 100% full potential to be obsessed with the world of Warhammer, and I can already see my wallet staring at me over there on the shelf with pleading eyes, begging me not to. But me being an addict of fictional worlds, I need more. I need recommendations for other Warhammer stuff, novels, games, anything. Let me know in the comments, and I'll give you bonus points if what you recommend is easily digestible for someone new to the franchise like myself. But anyway, what's the gameplay like in the campaign? Like a lot of other things in Space Marine 2, it's simple yet satisfying. Most missions will just have you going from point A to point B in a pretty linear fashion while killing things and doing simple objectives along the way. Those objectives will mostly be things like clicking buttons on a terminal, or escorting a tank, or reaching a certain area to activate a cutscene that pushes the story forward, or clicking a button on another terminal. But the why you're doing things isn't really the draw in this game. The why is just an excuse for the how. How are you achieving these objectives? By slaughter, massacre, and extermination, of course. By once again picking up the gun and pulling the trigger. You get assault rifles, submachine guns, flamethrowers, and energy weapons, just to name a few. You get a few different grenade options, a few different melee options as well, like a chainsaw sword, a giant Bowie knife-looking thing, and a hammer, which I assume is the Warhammer that the franchise is named after, but let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. And the game is really old school too when it comes to how you go about getting your weapons and choosing your loadout. Before each mission, you select the guns you want to start off with, but when you're actually on a planet, about every 50 yards, you'll just happen upon a buffet of guns and grenades that are just conveniently splayed about, beckoning you to change up your playstyle a little bit. And most missions are set up and structured in a very similar way. Like I said, most of the time it's just getting from point A to point B while killing things and pressing buttons, but that's not to say that the missions don't manage to find a way to change things up. They do. For example, in the second mission, there's an enemy type that is easily defeated with a flamethrower, but besides that, a flamethrower isn't really a go-to weapon of choice. And then there's a part of the mission where you get access to a jetpack and combat becomes a lot more vertical, and you get some abilities you didn't have before. And I know I keep repeating myself here, but the core gameplay is really fun and really addictive, and it's definitely the saving grace of this game, especially when it comes to the campaign, because I do have criticisms with the campaign I want to get into now. The first thing is, I think the level designs are far too linear. Most of the time, everywhere you are just feels like a hallway in disguise. If you're in the jungle, it's just one long, narrow path that turns into another long, narrow path. If you're outside somewhere, a huge battle is happening, it's still a straight one-way path. If you're in a facility, it's literally just hallway after hallway with no real choice or sense of exploration. And I don't mind linear games at all. I've said this in a lot of my videos, but the vast majority of my favorite games are linear games. But I believe there's such a thing as a game being too linear, and this is an example of that. I just don't like it when a map looks like veins or the close-up of a nervous system where there's not even an illusion of openness, where everywhere you go is the only obvious place you can reach. There are a few parts of some levels that do kind of give you the chance to breathe a little bit, especially in later parts of the campaign, but still, most of the time the game feels very claustrophobic, and not because of the hordes that are always trying to sack you. But I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't at least mention that the level design does add to the old school shooter vibe the game has, and if I'm being honest, it was kind of refreshing at times, not needing to think about where I was going or worry about missing secret areas. It was fun to just kind of turn off my brain and allow myself to be corralled.
Reminder, priority is to cover ground as quickly as possible. Engaging elite countermeasures.
Now let's talk about operations. I have a feeling this is where the dedicated player base is going to sink most of their hours into. Operations, for the most part, are missions that play out exactly like campaign missions, where you go to point A to point B while doing micro tasks, but they're meant to be replayed, and they have their own leveling system, gear system, and skill trees. There's also different classes you can play as, which is pretty sick. In the campaign, you play as the character of Titus, but here you get to do a whole bunch of customization. At the beginning of each operation, you get to select your class. There's a sniper class where you can turn invisible and disappear, a class where you get a badass shield and you use a sword as your primary, another class where you use a Gatling gun and you can have a force bubble conceal your entire body, just to name a few. But you can also customize your armor here more so than in the campaign, and as you level up, you unlock different guns, different appearance options, and a bunch of different skills. In full transparency, I haven't really messed around with the skill tree in operations, but I looked through it a little bit and I was surprised at the variety and how most of the options didn't just look like passives that you'll forget you even activated, but it looks like stuff that'll actually change up the flow of gameplay a little bit. And again, I have a feeling that this will be what keeps a lot of people hooked to the game, not only because of the leveling up and the skill tree, but because these operations are, again, designed to be replayed. Before you start matchmaking, you select between 4 different difficulty levels, where the harder the difficulty, the better the rewards. But another thing that's really cool about operations is that their narrative is directly tied to the narrative in the campaign. For example, in the second mission of the campaign, Titus talks about how there's another squad of Space Marines that's creating a diversion for you, and then the first operation that you can play is that mission that the other squad was doing. I just thought that it was cooler than making them be completely disconnected.
What truths need revealing?
The servants of the corpse god claims the objective!
Now let's talk about the PvP multiplayer, which again, I for some reason wasn't even expecting to be a thing in this. It's good. I'm actually having a lot of fun with it. There's 3 game modes. The first is your basic 3 objective game mode, where there's a point A, a point B, and a point C on the map, and both teams are trying to capture them. And for each point your team has claimed, you get a point every 3 seconds or whatever. The other game mode is just team deathmatch. We all know how team deathmatch works. 1 kill equals 1 point. First team to the score limit wins. And the last game mode is where there's 1 objective on the map and both teams are trying to capture that 1 objective at the same time, and it keeps moving around the map every 60 seconds. And let's be honest, these aren't exactly the most unique game modes ever. Concord had all 3 of those game modes. I'm pretty sure Star Wars Hunters has those exact 3 game modes, and obviously Call of Duty. Pretty much every online PvP shooter has those exact 3 game modes, but that doesn't mean it's not really fun here. And that's because of the same 3 words I keep repeating like a parrot: the old school vibe. And I know I'm a broken record. It wouldn't be a review of mine if I didn't double down on some of the specific points, but it genuinely reminds me of the PS3 era or the PS4 era of gaming, when a single player centric game had multiplayer PvP game modes that I'm sure the developers never put much stock into, but nonetheless they ended up being addicting and fun as fuck, and people look back on them with nothing but fond memories in hopes that for some reason the servers get turned back on. Games like this that come to mind are one of the Assassin's Creed games, I forget which one, I think either 2 or Brotherhood, where you pretend to be an NPC while you're trying to assassinate other players who are also trying to be NPCs, or Dead Rising 2, the wicked underrated PvP game mode where you're in like a zombie game show competing for points, or hell, even The Last of Us. The PvP mode in The Last of Us certainly was not in much of the marketing for that game, but that didn't stop me from putting over 100 hours into it, and I still consider that to be one of the greatest PvP experiences I've had to date. But anyway, obviously Space Marine 2's multiplayer doesn't play or feel like either of those games, but it still reminds me of that era of gaming. The gameplay in multiplayer is pretty much the exact same core gameplay as Operations. You choose between the same classes. As you level up, you unlock different guns and paint for your suit, but instead of fighting hordes of NPCs, you're fighting, I don't know, some dude named Derek from South Carolina. Health does regen on its own in multiplayer though, that is different, and I can say, based on the games that I've played so far, it's pretty well balanced as far as I can tell. There's no class or weapon that's seriously OP, and most games were surprisingly close, usually ending just a few points from each other. There's a small handful of maps that are shared between each game mode. They're distinct enough from each other, but it did get kind of boring, kind of fast since there's so few. I'm not sure how focused on PvP the developers will be in the future, but I hope they add at least a couple more maps. And this is wishful thinking, but I think a different game mode could really serve this game well. I think a game mode like Resident Evil Resistance would fit this game perfectly. I know practically nobody played that game, but I liked it a lot. Basically, 4 players were survivors and they had to make it through a map, while 1 player placed NPC enemies in strategic places throughout, while simultaneously making other objectives like locking doors and hiding keys, and every now and then the enemy player could control an enemy NPC. It's also pretty much how Evil Dead the game plays as well, but I think the foundation for Warhammer Space Marine 2 is perfect for a game mode just like that. But anyway, do I have any criticisms with the multiplayer? Yes, I do. And that's that as of right now, the servers are wicked inconsistent and they don't work half of the time. So many times I'd select a game mode and it would just say match starting just for the match to never actually start. Sometimes it would take me around 30 minutes to even get into a game, but luckily when you do find a working lobby, it tends to keep you there, which is cool. Also, performance in PvP is worse than single player, but I feel like that's a given. You'll see some frame rate issues and some stuttering, but nothing that killed the experience or swayed the game in any way. But anyway, as you can tell, I'm really enjoying Space Marine 2. It's quickly turning me into a fan of the franchise, but mostly, I'm just loving the old school charm this game has, not only from the gameplay, but how it's designed as a product. I love that it's a campaign, first and foremost, and that's the main focus and the main draw, the core of the game, but that core has 2 massive swole, incredible Hulk-sized arms with its operations and its PvP multiplayer. I just wish more games were still made like this today, but honestly, I can see some people wanting more from this game. If none of what I said and none of the gameplay you've seen excites you, this game probably won't be for you because it's very simple and straightforward in terms of its gameplay. And yeah, the game has some layers to it, especially with operations and a bit with the PvP multiplayer, but if you don't like turn off your brain, straightforward third-person shooters where what you see is what you get, you'll probably get bored with this game before you feel like you got your money's worth. But yeah, that's my thoughts after playing Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 for a few days now. Have you played it yet? If you have, let me know what you're thinking about it in the comments down below. Are you liking it? Are you disliking it? Or are you going to ignore it completely? And if you are, let me know why, because I'm curious. But once again, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and thank you for watching, especially if you watched this far.
The giant.